Don't go in there, the wise voice in your head shouted as you clicked into this nightmare-inducing video. Well, if you have a fascination with the supernatural, all things mysterious, and have a super cute nightlight you'd like to get some more use out of, welcome to the team of Halloween and ghost story enthusiasts. It's good to have you. So let's skip straight to the spooky highlight you came for. The scariest ghost stories ever. If you're thinking, yeah, right, I don't scare easy, hear us out. You're here. Famous hauntings. The Amityville haunting. Though the Amityville house is most famously linked to the Ronald DeFeo killings in November of 1974, it was originally used to house Native Americans that were insane, sick or withering. Those Indians were buried on the property, obviously from less than peaceful circumstances. Did these Indians, buried on unconsecrated ground, lend to the later strange tragedy that would make this house so famous? In the early morning hours of November 13, 1974, Ronald DeFeo fatally shot his father, two brothers and his sister. All were found in their beds, face down, and despite the neighbors' houses being close together, no one heard screams or noises. Mr. DeFeo claimed that ghosts were present during the events, and had goaded him into eliminating his siblings, though his original intent was just to executing his father. The home at 112 Ocean Avenue eventually went up for sale, and was later purchased by George and Kathy Lutz for $80,000. Though they were told by the realtor about the tragedy, the Lutzes were so enamored with the home, pool, garage and 4,000 square feet of waterfront that they immediately made an offer. The next 28 days are the events that led to the book and movie, Amityville Horror. Amityville moving day should have been a clue when the leashed family dog tried to flee the property, jumped the fence and hung himself. Though the dog survived the ordeal, this was an ominous sign of things to come. What followed could not have been fluffed up any more by Hollywood itself. The Lutzes claimed that keyholes oozed goo, the toilet water turned black, and nasty smells started to permeate the house. Septic problems. George started to get sick and lose weight, but if it was a general septic or well problem, the whole family would have been affected, especially the children. Later on, noises entered the house. The front door slammed on its own, and footsteps pattered about the house. George also stated that static noises could be heard. When he investigated the downstairs area where they thought the source was, he found the furniture moved and the carpets rolled back. At the suggestion of friends who said they too had experienced ghostly experiences, the Lord's Prayer was recited room to room. That's when the noise went from static to full-blown words, including one screamed phrase, "Will you please stop?" As if that wasn't enough to motivate this family to leave the home immediately, entities gathered strength and started making themselves physically present. Kathy claimed that she felt a presence embracing her from behind. The family claimed they could see eyes peering at them through the windows at night. When they would investigate, all they would find were hoof tracks accompanied by the odd squeal. Other sightings included a little boy on the second-story landing and a dark cloaked figure. Their daughter Missy then developed a ghostly friendship with someone by the name of Jody. Missy claimed that Jody was an angel and could change shapes. Ominously, she said that Jody had told her, "You live here forever." The departure from the home is a bit ambiguous, but the way George tells it, the house almost felt like it was coming alive with flexing walls and groans. They decided to make a very quick departure to Kathy's mother's house during a very stormy night. After the Lutzes fled, they requested paranormal investigators, Ed and Lorraine Warren, to visit the home. The Warrens went to the house along with a Duke University professor and the president of the American Society for Psychic Research. Their reports included strong visual and clairaudible messages from the ghosts dwelling in the home, air that seemed to solidify, and Ed claimed that he saw shadows along with thousands of pinpoints of light which was down in the cellar, and those shadows tried to push him about, scaring him out of his mind. There was not a person at the investigation that didn't declare the place felt of utter terror. Lorraine declared that the stronghold from the ghosts would be too severe to ever dislodge. So wretched was the feeling that the Duke professor rumored to have passed out from fear. Whether or not facts of this case were stretched or complete hoax altogether, it still remains one of the most frightening and sensationalized ghost stories of our time. All the security in the world cannot keep ghosts out of the White House. And I'm not just talking ghosts in the closet, but actual apparitions. Though the White House was relatively new for its first reported sighting in the late 1700s, it was surrounded by towns along the Potomac River, and as life does everywhere in the world, there were deaths of all kinds and by all means. John Adams, the second United States president, moved in when he won the presidency in 1797. He and his wife Abigail were tenants there from him taking office to the end of his term in 1801. During their 4-year tenure there, his wife would often be found doing laundry in the sunny and dry room called the East Room. Here she reported seeing a woman wearing a cap and lace shawl, arms outstretched as if she were welcoming her into a haunting embrace. Ghosts in the White House. Another specter was David Burns, who was a large landowner, and sold what the White House and much of Washington sits on now to the government. Both the guard and a White House seamstress reported hearing a haunting voice declare itself as "I'm Mr. Burns." though he was not actually seen by either, more a disembodied voice generally heard from the vicinity of the Yellow Oval Room. It makes sense that as White House occupants age and pass on, that presidents themselves would make ghostly appearances. One of the most haunted rooms in the White House was former Andrew Jackson's bedchamber, the Rose Room. Andrew Jackson was reported to be heard by the then wife of President Lincoln, Mary Todd. She was keenly interested in the occult, and it was reported that she would hold seances in order to communicate with her sons, but would sometimes receive cantankerous messages from the previous president, Andrew Jackson, who was reported to be surly in nature. The ghost of President Lincoln was also reported to be seen and heard by numerous staff and residents of the White House. In fact, his spirit is the most prolific of ghost sightings to date. Calvin Coolidge's wife, Grace, was one of the first residents to report seeing President Lincoln, while she and her husband resided there from 1923 to 1929. She reported seeing him gaze out at previous battlefields beyond the Potomac. It's interesting to me that so many First Ladies reported seeing ghosts at the White House. Another First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, said that she felt President Lincoln's presence while she did her work in the Lincoln bedroom at night when it was most quiet. I personally think Lincoln continues to make so many appearances at the White House because his life was tragically cut short, an impetus for being earthbound. He was also one of the most beloved presidents in our nation's history, and that energetic tie to society may have created a stronger bond at the White House. Other people too reported seeing him. Winston Churchill reported seeing Lincoln by a fireplace when he emerged from taking a bath. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands fainted dead away when she opened her door in the middle of the night in response to a knock, only to find Lincoln standing there, top hat and all. I'm sure many old homes are haunted, but rare are they so famous or the holder of such impactful people as the United States White House. On one of the main residential streets in my town, there is a burnt-out home which suffered from a fire in June of 2019, which consisted of 3 stacked apartment units, one on each floor. No one knows how the fire started, but the home is beyond repair and is likely to be torn down in the next year. The fire was so bad that it nearly caught the neighboring building on fire. Thankfully, no one died, but it left 3 families temporarily homeless. The front of the building is entirely burned, with all windows boarded up, and the roof is completely burned through in the front of the building. The back of the building consists of 3 stacked decks overlooking a small parking lot and baseball field, and from the back of the building, you cannot tell that there was a fire, as it remains relatively intact. According to town records, the building dates to 1900. I have been inside the building one time. When I was at university, the students renting the bottom floor and basement hosted frat parties there. I never thought there was anything odd about the building, other than that it was incredibly run down, and the party was evacuated due to a smell of gas in the building which, thankfully, turned out to not be an emergency. I never happened to return. But I pass by the building every night when I go for my walk. Yesterday, I went for my evening walk and for the first time, as I passed the building, I decided to look at it more closely. In the parking lot behind the building there were, as always, 2 children around age 10 to 15 kicking around a soccer ball. I waved at them as I passed and looked up at the building. I looked into the darkness of the building inside, but one window behind the second floor deck caught my eye. In the immense darkness was a silhouette of a human looking out at the 2 children. I could not make out if it was male or female, and I could not see any facial features, just the outline of a person staring out the window in the direction of the children. The 2 children know me and recognize me on my walks each day, so I asked, "Do you see someone in that window up there?" But by the time they looked up, it was gone. Ah, well. I guess it was my imagination. No one would even be able to get into that building, the doors are completely boarded up. Forget I said anything. I knew what I saw, but I did not want to scare the children, who lived in the next building over. Today, I was intent to capture a photo of the figure in the second floor window. As I passed by the building and waved at the children playing soccer, I nervously looked at the building, but I could not see any figure in the second floor window. After scanning the building with my eyes, right as I was about to give up and chalk it up to my imagination, I finally saw it. This time, the figure was in the 3rd floor window, right in the center of the building looking out at the deck, watching the children, and I was able to deduce that the figure is male. It was wearing what resembled a bowler derby hat, completely dark with no facial features discernible, standing out among the darkness. I racked my brain for an explanation of whether a person could possibly be in that building, and how it could be possible, since the ceiling is caved in most of the building, the doors are boarded up, and only the back windows are not boarded up. The upper levels of the deck are not even accessible from the outside of the building, so it is unlikely someone climbed up the deck. Could it be a spirit? Why would he be watching the children? Why is he there? I wonder if fires and other traumatic events stir up negative energy. Indian monsoons in 2011 were fortunately on time, and weather was really very cool and pleasant, a relief from the hot and dusty summers in Pune. Lonavala is a hell station around 90 km from Pune and is a haven for tourists, especially during this time of the year. The lush green valleys with streams flowing make the environment particularly scenic. There are also some old Buddhist caves like Karla, Bet's caves, which have a lot of historical significance. Truckers can undertake treks to some of the nearby forts like Rajmachi, Logad, Visapur and Takona to enjoy the pleasant weather and feel close to nature. My contact with Lonavala has been since the 80s when my father worked with Tata Power Company. For around 5 years. We had the biggest bungalow in the entire Tata residential colony. Built in the colonial-style architecture, it was a sprawling 2,000 square feet bungalow, with a beautiful lawn in front of the house, and an outhouse, servants' quarters, behind it. The people there were a friendly lot and I have fond memories of the place. It is also the place where I had my initial experiences with the paranormal. These are mentioned in my earlier stories, namely the frail old man and the restless Peyton. Though quite unnerving, the place is still very close to my heart, and I make it a point to visit it a few times every year. In July, my wife and I were planning to spend the weekend lazing around the house after a hectic week in office. At around 6 p.m. on Friday, we received a call from my cousin Parag, mentioned in my earlier stories. He still lives in Lonavala and is associated with the hospitality industry. I was surprised to hear from him after such a long time. After exchanging the usual pleasantries, he came straight to the point. He was currently helping his friend in developing an old property in Lonavala into a resort. The resort was to open in a couple of weeks, and he wanted me to come over and spend a day over there with him. The offer seemed quite enticing because of the cool weather and the rains in Lonavala. My wife and I immediately packed our things and started off for Lonavala, which is an hour's drive from my place. We reached the yet-to-be-opened resort at around 8:30 p.m., and were warmly greeted by Parag. It was raining very heavily at that time, and hot tea along with piping hot bhajiyas offered to us were more than willingly gobbled up quickly by us. Parag told us that the work at the resort was nearly complete with only some finishing touches remaining. Since it was raining heavily since afternoon, he had given the workers the rest of the day off with the promise that they would return early the next day. He then proceeded to show us the resort, which was indeed very tastefully decorated. There was an air of nostalgia to the whole decor, as if it was a place designed during the British colonial era. When I mentioned this to Parag, he told me that it was indeed a guest house built for the British guests in the early 30s, and he had tried his best to retain the same old world charm, without disturbing too much of the original architecture. The highlight of the resort were 3 heritage suites, one of which was offered to us for the night. My wife and I were really thrilled at the thought of the idea of reliving the bygone era. We soon began chatting with Parag about old times and our earlier paranormal adventures, that we didn't realize how quickly the time had passed. After a nice hot dinner served by the resort staff, we slowly retired to our own rooms for the night. It was well past midnight by then. At around 3 a.m., I heard a faint knock on the door. I found my wife sleeping soundly beside me. I decided to ignore it at first, thinking that it might be some sound coming from the lawns outside, and go to sleep. After 15 minutes or so, I again heard the faint knocking sound on my door. This time I was absolutely sure that someone had knocked the door. Not wanting to disturb my wife, I slowly got out of my bed and opened the door. To my surprise, there was no one outside. But then I suddenly felt someone push me and enter the room. I felt really scared at the turn of events. Quickly getting a grip of myself, I immediately shut the door and tiptoed back to bed and went back to sleep. I couldn't sleep a wink after that incident, and the room felt colder than it was before I opened the door. Fortunately, nothing else happened that night. During breakfast the next morning, I casually brought out this subject to Parag, and was surprised to find that I wasn't the first person to have experienced it. He told me that a couple of weeks back a friend and his wife who had come over had been put up in the same room. They too had experienced the knocks on the door and the chill inside the room subsequently. Having experienced 2 such occurrences before this, both of us were naturally excited. We decided to investigate the matter and bring it to a logical conclusion before the opening ceremony of the resort. My wife was still blissfully unaware of my previous night's encounter, and we decided to keep it that way. Parag made up an excuse that he needed me for some work at the resort. We sent her to Parag's house, which is quite near to the place. It was Saturday morning and we only had one day to investigate the matter, as I had to return by Sunday evening. We decided quickly to look into the old document archives which were kept in the storeroom to get an idea as to who had owned this place previously. We found out that in the early 30s, the place was owned by a British gentleman by the name of John Scott, who ran a small guest house for British Army officers who used to visit the place. He used to run the place along with his wife. We also found an old paper cutting which read as follows: mysterious disappearance of guest house owner and wife. The police had closed the case as unsolved. We also found out that the guest house lay unused until India's independence and was then auctioned off. Surprisingly, none of the previous owners had demolished the old guest house until Parag's friend bought the place and decided to redevelop it. There was an old photograph of Mr. and Mrs. Scott standing outside one of the rooms. Upon close observation, it was clear to us that it was the same room which we were sleeping the night before. The questions before us were as follows. If it was a spirit, why was it knocking the door? What was there inside the room which it was looking for? It was around 2 p.m. by that time, and Parag took a call that we should go inside the room and try to search the room for any clues. Parag told me that he had especially instructed his workers not to damage anything inside these heritage suites, so that they retained the same old charm of the colonial era. We searched the place carefully but were unable to find anything there. Finally, at our wits' end, we decided to call off the search and spend the night there. This was our last resort in trying to determine the strange occurrences in that room. I called up my wife and told her that our work at the resort wasn't over, and told her to spend the night at Parag's place with his wife and parents. She suspected that something was amiss, but fortunately didn't try to probe too deep in the matter. We decided to have dinner at around 9 p.m., and then wait in the room for the rest of the night. We sat in the room chatting for some time, and then both of us started feeling sleepy. I do not know when we both dozed off until the time I suddenly woke up to a knock on the door. I was alert and immediately woke up Parag. We also noticed that the whole room was dark, perhaps due to a power cut in the area which is common in these parts. We had prepared ourselves for this eventuality and had armed ourselves with lanterns, candles and a couple of sticks, just in case they were required. The candles and lantern were kept inside the room in such a way that they illuminated the room to some extent. Now, the big question was who would open the door. After my eerie experience the previous night, I flatly refused. Parag, being the brave one, had to muster up courage and decided to open the door. I then chanced upon a rope lying in one of the corner of the room. We decided to tie the rope to the handle of the door. Parag would open the latch, and quickly come back to the corner of the room, where I would be sitting with the rope in my hand, and slowly pull the door open. This would help us see clearly as to what happened after the door opened. Around 15 minutes had passed since the first knock, and it happened again. There was a second knock on the door, this time a bit harder than the first. As planned, Parag opened the latch and returned to the corner of the room where I was sitting with the rope in my hand. I slowly tugged the rope and the door creaked open. There was absolute pin-drop silence outside, and both of us shuddered to think as to what would happen next. We then heard the noise of someone walking and stepping the room, though we couldn't see anyone. Then something unexpected happened. In candlelight we could see two shadows slowly forming on the floor. One shadow was that of a man and other was a woman. Both Parag and I were absolutely petrified, but somehow didn't lose control of ourselves. The two shadows slowly made their way into the bathroom. We followed quietly behind them with a lantern in our hand. The shadows went up to a bathtub placed at the far end of the bathroom. The shadows were still for some time at that place before disappearing into thin air. For the entire duration since we opened the door, the temperature inside was very chilly and cold. After the two shadows left us, the temperature started returning to normal. Both of us were scared, and it took us around half an hour to come to terms with what we had seen. It was clear to us that the spirits weren't trying to harm us. What were they trying to do then, was the question before us. It then occurred to us that perhaps the spirits were trying to tell us something. Parag had this idea that since they had led us to the bathroom, there might be something there which might give us a clue. Parag arranged for some workers the next morning, and had them dig the bathroom section of the room. In the process of doing so, the bathtub was also removed and dug up. And there it was, the answer which we were so desperately looking for. There were two skeletons, one of a man and the other of a woman, piled one above the other, right beneath the place where the bathtub was kept. The spirits had led us right to their final resting place. Parag's friend arrived at site and was informed of the previous night's events. He was very cooperative and informed the police immediately. The forensics determined that the skeletons were at least 70 to 80 years old, which coincided with the time when the Scots had disappeared. Since there was nothing much to pursue, since this was something which had happened a long time ago, the police closed the matter under unsolved cases. Parag's friend was happy that this was discovered before the resort had officially opened its doors to tourists. The bathroom was duly repaired and the room once again restored to its original charming self. But what had happened to the Scots is still unknown. It might have been someone close to the Scots who might have been the perpetrator of the crime, judging by the way the crime was committed and the bodies neatly concealed for nearly a century. Who did it will be an unsolved mystery forever. Whatever the case, the remains were taken to a graveyard and given a proper burial. Another thing that puzzles me to this date is that I did not see any shadows on the first night, nor did Parag's other friend who happened to be there. What made the shadows appear on the second night is something which still intrigues me to this day. As for my wife, she was surprised and a little annoyed at not being told of our adventure in the beginning itself. But she has eventually forgiven me. I checked on Parag around a month after the resort opened. There was no untoward incident which was reported after the bodies were taken from there and buried. Perhaps this was what was required to put the two restless spirits to rest.